John and Sarah Davis had always been regarded as the ideal couple. From the outside, their marriage seemed to be a dream. Two people perfectly in sync, living a life most would envy. They had 2 children, a comfortable home in a peaceful, suburban neighborhood, and jobs that provided them with everything they needed. John, a successful businessman, was often praised for his dedication and ambition, while Sarah, a loving wife and mother, was known for her warmth and kindness. The couple frequently hosted gatherings, and their life was often shared on social media, giving the impression of happiness and contentment. But like many couples, the perfect image began to fade over time. John, who had always been devoted to his work, started spending longer hours at the office, often returning home late, his mind preoccupied with business matters. Sarah, once an active participant in their social life, began noticing the subtle changes in John's behavior. He was often distracted, lost in thought, and distant. Conversations that once flowed easily between them became strained, and the emotional intimacy they shared seemed to be slipping away. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off as a phase, maybe just the stress of work. But as weeks turned into months, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of distance between them. John had always been a man of few words, but now even their daily interactions felt forced. He would often come home late, excuse himself after a quick dinner, and retreat to his office or the guest bedroom. When Sarah attempted to talk about it, John would dismiss her concerns, insisting that it was just the pressures of running a successful business. One evening, Sarah decided to confront John about the situation. She had begun to suspect that something was off, but she didn't know what. She questioned him about his late nights and whether there was something he wasn't telling her. John reassured her that it was just work, that he was doing everything he could to secure their future. He promised to make more time for her and the kids, but his actions didn't align with his words. It wasn't long before Sarah's suspicions grew stronger. She noticed strange behavior. John's phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always on silent, and he'd become protective of it, often taking it with him when he left the house. His social media accounts, once filled with pictures of family outings and celebrations, had become sparse. He stopped posting photos of their vacations or family gatherings, and when Sarah mentioned it, he brushed it off as a simple change of habits. But it wasn't just his phone that raised questions. Sarah began to hear whispers from friends and acquaintances, murmurs about John being seen with a colleague named Lisa. Lisa was younger, attractive, and worked closely with John in the same firm. At first, Sarah dismissed it as office gossip, but the whispers grew louder. A few of their mutual friends hinted at a possible affair, though they didn't have any solid proof. Still, the thought lingered in Sarah's mind, gnawing at her. One afternoon while John was at work, Sarah decided to check his phone. She had never done anything like this before, but her instincts told her that something wasn't right. What she found shocked her to the core. Dozens of text messages, some of them flirtatious, others more intimate, were exchanged between John and Lisa. There were also pictures, innocuous at first, but increasingly personal. Sarah's heart sank. The betrayal was clear. John had been having an affair, and it wasn't just a passing fling. It was serious. Her world, which had seemed so secure, began to crumble. The perfect life she had built with John was a lie. The man she had trusted with everything had betrayed her in the worst possible way. But what hurt the most was the realization that he had been hiding this affair from her for so long. The emotional distance, the late nights, the secrecy. It all made sense now. John wasn't just busy with work. he was busy with someone else. Sarah didn't know what to do next. She was torn between confronting him immediately or quietly gathering more information. But before she could make up her mind, something far more disturbing happened. She discovered that John had planned to meet Lisa the very night Sarah had planned a family outing. As the evidence mounted, so did her sense of dread. The life she had known was unraveling, and she had no idea where it would lead her. Sarah Davis vanished on a chilly autumn evening, leaving no trace behind. She had been running errands, a simple task she had done countless times before, but that night she never returned. Her disappearance was sudden and mysterious, and no one could explain what had happened to her. The house was eerily quiet when John returned home late that evening, expecting his wife to be there as usual. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. Her car was gone, and the front door was locked, just as she had always done. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of forced entry, nothing out of the ordinary, except for her absence. John immediately called the police, his voice frantic as he explained that Sarah was missing. He told them that she must have been abducted. He couldn't fathom any other explanation for her disappearance. It wasn't like Sarah to leave without telling him or their children. She had always been the one to keep the family grounded, the one who planned their day-to-day routines. The thought of her simply walking away didn't seem plausible to John, and he began to speculate that someone must have taken her. Detective Emma Clark, who was assigned to the case, began her investigation by retracing Sarah's steps. The last known sighting of Sarah had been at a local grocery store, just a few miles from their home. The store's security footage showed her entering, buying a few items, and leaving shortly after. She seemed calm and normal, nothing out of the ordinary in her demeanor. There was no indication that she had been followed or harassed while there. But when she didn't return home after running those simple errands, it seemed all too strange. The police quickly discovered that Sarah's phone had been abandoned on the side of the road, its screen cracked, as if it had been discarded hastily. The location of the phone seemed suspicious. It wasn't in the path she would normally take. It raised more questions than answers. Why had she thrown her phone away? Was she trying to escape, or had she been forced to get rid of it? These questions weighed heavily on Detective Clark's mind. The more she dug into Sarah's disappearance, the more unsettling the case became. While the search for Sarah continued, John appeared to be beside himself with worry. His emotions were all over the place. One moment, he was pleading for information, begging anyone with knowledge of Sarah's whereabouts to come forward. The next, he seemed detached, almost too calm given the gravity of the situation. He refused to entertain any suggestion that Sarah might have left voluntarily. Yet, his erratic behavior only fueled suspicions about him. At first, the detectives assumed that John's distress was genuine, but as they continued their investigation, his actions began to seem increasingly odd. He was evasive about certain details, particularly about his whereabouts on the night Sarah disappeared. When asked to account for his movements, he mentioned being at a business dinner, but no one could confirm his alibi. The night of Sarah's disappearance, John had also neglected to mention one crucial detail. His phone records revealed a series of calls to someone named Lisa, his colleague from work. The timing of these calls was suspiciously close to when Sarah would have been leaving the store. Detective Clark found herself torn between believing that Sarah's disappearance was a tragic abduction or uncovering a deeper, darker truth. The clues were stacking up, and they seemed to point in an unsettling direction. Why had John been so vague? And who was this Lisa, who seemed to be entwined in his life at the same time his wife was going missing? As the investigation progressed, The answers seemed more elusive, and the truth was slipping further away. Was Sarah's disappearance the result of a cruel crime, or was it something far more complicated? The questions were multiplying, but the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. The more the detectives uncovered, the clearer it became that John's perfect marriage and the life he had built with Sarah might not have been as perfect as it appeared. Detective Clark could sense that the truth was lurking somewhere beneath the surface, and she was determined to find it, no matter where it led. As the investigation into Sarah's disappearance continued, the mystery deepened. Detective Emma Clark had begun to focus more closely on the details surrounding John's behavior and his connections to a woman named Lisa. Lisa was a colleague of John's, a younger woman who had worked closely with him for several years at his company. The police had learned that Lisa and John had become more than just professional acquaintances. As the investigation into their relationship grew, it became clear that Lisa was not just someone John worked with. She was the woman he had been having an affair with. At first, Lisa denied any involvement in Sarah's disappearance. She told the police that she had no idea where Sarah was, and expressed her concern for John, claiming that she hadn't seen him in the days leading up to Sarah's vanishing. But as the questioning continued, Lisa's story began to shift. She had been seen leaving the same cafe where Sarah frequently visited, on the very day Sarah had disappeared. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Lisa's presence at the cafe that day, coupled with her secret relationship with John, made her an immediate person of interest in the investigation. Detective Clark pressed Lisa for more details. She asked about the nature of her relationship with John, and Lisa seemed increasingly uncomfortable. The more the detective asked, the more Lisa's demeanor changed. She fidgeted and avoided direct eye contact, a stark contrast to her earlier calm and composed attitude. Lisa claimed that her relationship with John had ended a few weeks before Sarah's disappearance, but the evidence painted a different picture. John's phone records, which had been thoroughly examined, revealed dozens of calls and messages exchanged between him and Lisa in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance. The frequency of their contact was disturbing, especially given the timing. John had been texting Lisa in the hours before Sarah left the house to run errands. The messages were flirtatious at first, but they soon became more intimate. John's behavior suggested that the affair had been ongoing, and perhaps even escalating. Detective Clark began to piece together a timeline that pointed to a darker truth. On the night before Sarah vanished, John had arranged to meet with Lisa at a nearby hotel. While John had initially denied being in contact with Lisa that night, the evidence didn't lie. Surveillance footage from a nearby store captured John's car near the hotel, and the time matched the window during which he and Lisa had been texting each other. John's alibi, which he had insisted was solid, now seemed increasingly dubious. When confronted with the mounting evidence, Lisa's story began to unravel. She admitted that she had been in contact with John more than she had originally let on. However, she continued to deny any involvement in Sarah's disappearance. She insisted that Sarah had been a loving and devoted wife, and she had no reason to harm her. But Detective Clark's instincts told her otherwise. It was clear that something more sinister had been unfolding in the shadows. Lisa's insistence on remaining innocent only raised more red flags. At the same time, John's reactions became more erratic. Initially, he had been calm and cooperative, but now, as the weight of the evidence against him grew, he became defensive and paranoid. He insisted that he had nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance, and that his affair with Lisa had nothing to do with it. But the detectives weren't convinced. John's growing anger and refusal to cooperate only deepened their Suspicions. The more they investigated, the more it seemed that John had been hiding something much darker than an affair. As the investigation progressed, Detective Clark uncovered more damning evidence. A witness came forward, someone who had seen John and Lisa together in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance. They had been meeting in secret, often at odd hours, away from the prying eyes of the office. The witness also recalled seeing John leave his office building the night Sarah vanished, looking unusually hurried and nervous. The more the detective uncovered, the clearer it became that John had been living a double life, and that Sarah's disappearance was part of a much larger, more dangerous story than anyone had initially believed. With each new piece of evidence, the web of lies surrounding John and Lisa became more tangled. Detective Clark now believed that Sarah's disappearance was no accident. It was clear that John had been hiding a dangerous secret, and he wasn't the only one. As the investigation moved forward, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance took a startling turn when Detective Emma Clark uncovered a hidden storage unit rented under John's name. The discovery was unexpected, and its contents would prove to be more than just troubling. The storage unit had been secured months earlier, long before Sarah's disappearance, and the authorities had no idea what they would find inside. When they opened it, the evidence was chilling. Inside the unit, there were several items that raised immediate concerns. First, there were pieces of clothing, garments that didn't belong to Sarah. A set of men's clothes, notably a new shirt and a pair of pants, were neatly folded in a corner. There were also bloodstains on them, stains that appeared to be fresh, though they had been carefully cleaned. The clothes seemed out of place, and upon further inspection, the blood was found to contain traces of Sarah's DNA. The revelation was enough to send shockwaves through the investigation. Among the other items were a suitcase and a set of tools. The suitcase, which had been wiped down thoroughly, still contained fibers that were later identified as belonging to Sarah. The tools, while common, raised questions about whether they had been used for something far more sinister. Detective Clark began to put together the pieces of the puzzle. John had been involved in something far darker than an affair. His actions now seemed to point to a deliberate attempt to cover up a crime. The discovery of the blood-stained clothes and the suitcase raised even more suspicions about what had happened to Sarah. Had she been killed? And if so, where? Was this a calculated murder, or was something even more disturbing at play? Detective Clark was no longer looking at this case as a simple missing persons investigation. She was starting to believe that Sarah's disappearance was the result of a carefully orchestrated plan. But the real question was whether John had acted alone, or if someone else had helped him. The next few days brought further evidence that would unravel the mystery even further. The investigation into John's phone records revealed more incriminating details. Not only had he been in constant communication with Lisa, but there were also several calls made to an unknown number. The identity of the person on the other end remained a mystery, but it was clear that John had been trying to cover his tracks. The timing of these calls, some made at late hours of the night, suggested that he was in the process of coordinating something, though what exactly was still unclear. Detective Clark turned her focus back to John's movements in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance. A detailed timeline of his activities revealed a pattern of deceit. On the day Sarah went missing, John had told investigators that he had been home all day, but the evidence didn't align with his story. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed John's car leaving the area around the time Sarah was supposed to be running errands. He had then gone to a secluded area on the outskirts of town, where the police found traces of Sarah's personal items, a scarf, a pair of gloves and a necklace, buried under a pile of dirt. These items were unmistakably hers, and their discovery painted an even darker picture of the events leading up to her disappearance. John's story was starting to fall apart, but he still refused to cooperate fully. As the evidence mounted against him, he became more defensive and elusive. The police had their suspicions, but they needed solid proof that he was directly responsible for Sarah's fate. The storage unit, the blood-stained clothes, the items buried in the dirt, they were all circumstantial, but they painted a damning portrait of a man trying to cover up something much worse than an affair. In the meantime, Detective Clark turned her attention to Lisa once again. She had been caught in a web of lies and half-truths, and it was clear that she knew more than she had let on. When confronted with the new evidence, Lisa began to crack. She admitted that she had been present on the night of Sarah's disappearance, though she claimed she hadn't been involved in the crime itself. Lisa said she had been there to meet John, and that Sarah had shown up unexpectedly. According to Lisa, Sarah had confronted them, and a violent argument had ensued. Lisa claimed that she had left the scene before anything escalated, but her story didn't add up. Now, with both John and Lisa implicated, the investigation was heading toward a boiling point. Detective Clark felt she was getting closer to the truth, but she still didn't know the full extent of what had happened to Sarah. The evidence suggested murder, but without a body. There was no way to be certain. Still, the chilling discoveries in the storage unit, the blood-stained clothes, and the buried personal items pointed to a crime far more gruesome than anyone had imagined. The twisted web of lies, betrayal, and deceit was slowly unraveling, and the truth was beginning to surface, piece by piece. As the investigation reached its climax, the police had gathered enough evidence to make an arrest. John Davis was taken into custody on suspicion of his wife Sarah's murder. The mounting evidence against him was irrefutable, from the blood-stained clothing in the storage unit to the personal items found buried in the dirt, all pointing toward a deliberate and calculated crime. However, what shocked everyone most was the revelation of just how deep John's deception had run. John had been living a double life, and Sarah had been completely unaware of the extent of his betrayal. The affair with Lisa had been just the beginning of a carefully hidden secret life. John's need for control, his obsession with appearances, and his desire to keep his family intact had driven him to make a series of decisions that ultimately led to the devastating event. Detective Clark and her team believed that John had planned Sarah's disappearance with cold precision. He had arranged the perfect alibi, manipulated his way through the investigation, and even tried to cover his tracks by disposing of evidence. But what had truly driven him to such lengths? The answer was slowly emerging. Throughout the investigation, it became apparent that John's relationship with Lisa had spiraled out of control. What started as a simple affair had turned into a dangerous obsession. John had begun to envision a future with Lisa, one where he was free of his wife and the obligations of his family. The affair had become a toxic mix of lies, guilt, and desire. As Sarah's suspicions grew, and she began to confront John, the pressure began to mount. Fearing that Sarah might expose him, John took drastic measures. He saw no way out of his predicament other than eliminating the woman who stood in the way of his future with Lisa. On the night Sarah disappeared, John had lured her into a confrontation, planning to silence her once and for all. Lisa, who had been complicit in his plans, had been present when Sarah arrived at the location where John had set the stage for the tragedy. Sarah had confronted the two of them, demanding to know the truth about their relationship. The argument had escalated, and in the heat of the moment, John had resorted to violence. Sarah had been caught off guard, and the fight had turned deadly. In a blind rage, John had struck her, causing fatal injuries. Afterward, John had gone to great lengths to cover up the crime. With Lisa's help, he had disposed of Sarah's body, hidden her personal items, and cleaned the scene to erase all evidence. They had hoped to make it look like Sarah had disappeared voluntarily, as if she had simply walked away from her life. But the evidence gathered by the police told a different story. The discovery of the bloodstains, the clothes, the buried belongings, and the timeline of John's movements all pointed to a far darker and more calculated plan. As John sat in the interrogation room, the weight of his actions finally began to sink in. His once perfect life had crumbled around him. His affair, his lies, and his betrayal had led to the most horrific outcome imaginable. He had not only destroyed the life of the woman he had vowed to love and cherish, but he had also torn apart the lives of his children. The family he had worked so hard to build was now shattered, and the community that had once admired him now saw him as nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. Lisa, too, was arrested, though her involvement in the murder was less direct. She had been complicit in helping John cover up the crime, and although she had not physically harmed Sarah, her actions were just as damning. She had helped hide the truth, knowing full well what had happened. As the investigation continued, Lisa's role in the crime would be scrutinized further, but it was clear that she, too, had been swept up in a web of lies and manipulation. The final piece of the puzzle came when Detective Clark discovered an old journal belonging to John. In it, he had written about his frustrations with his marriage, his longing for freedom, and his obsession with Lisa. The journal entries painted a chilling picture of a man who had become consumed by his desires, willing to do anything to escape the life he had built. The pages revealed the dark thoughts that had led him to commit such an unthinkable act.